Hello everyone. We're going to start soon. I would like to welcome you to our Suite Solutions webinar on Jive and your structured content working together. I'm Miriam Brand. I'm the Marketing Communications Manager here at Suite Solutions. And our presenter today is Hannan Saltzman. But before he will start presenting, I would like to cover some housekeeping issues. You can type in questions at any point in the webinar, and they will be addressed during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. We're purposely leaving a few minutes at the end of the webinar so that we can address any questions that you may have. This webinar will also be available for viewing later. I'll be sending an email to everyone who attended and even everyone who didn't attend, and that will have a link to the webinar on our site. So as soon as the recorded webinar is up, I will update you in an email. However, that might take about a day. So don't worry if you don't get it within, you should get it within 24 hours. So I see some people are still joining. I'm going to wait just a few more minutes before handing off to Hannan. Okay, so I'm happy to pass the baton to Hannan Saltzman, our VP Product Management, who will be talking about Jive and your structured content working together. Hannan?
Yes, thank you, Miriam. Can you hear me okay?
You're coming through very, very clearly.
Okay, perfect. So hello, everybody. I'd like to thank you all for making the time to participate in this webinar. Now, we'll start by just saying that, many of us have heard about Omnichannel customer service. So your customers today interact with your organization through an average of over 6 different touch points and channels. So these include anything from email, chat, phone, Facebook, Twitter, and all the way to your corporate website, your documentation portal, and your customer community. Now, when interacting, your customers don't always stick to the same channel. Instead, they move between channels and they chart their own customer journeys. And during those journeys, they expect your organizations to provide a personalized experience. So, in other words, they expect you to understand them. And understanding meaning to know who they are and to know what exactly they're looking for. And they also expect you to be consistent. So, whenever a customer calls 1-800-SUPPORT or logs into your documentation portal or enters your Jive-powered social customer community, they expect to receive the same high quality and the same consistent content that will help them achieve the task that they need to complete, optimized for that specific touch point. So at Suite Solutions, that is what we do. We help companies deliver personalized and consistent technical product information to their customers across all touchpoints. So it doesn't really matter which way the customer decides to interact with you. We will make sure that they get accessibility to the same high-level consistent content from your single source publishing infrastructure. Now, specifically today, we will focus on how to make your structured content accessible to your Jive social community. So we will explain why you need to make that content accessible in your community. We will explain what are the challenges involved with getting your content out there efficiently. And we'll also talk about what are the kind of things that you need to be looking at to ensure that content is well integrated into your natural Jive workflow. So let's talk a little bit about the challenge. I assume that if you have already registered to this webinar, you know what Jive is, right? You're also an active user of Jives, and you actively leverage this enterprise social collaboration platform to generate business value for your organization. So while Jive can be used both internally, meaning for employee engagement, or externally, meaning for customer-facing communities, the goal is pretty much the same. It's all about increasing engagement and productivity. Now, in recent years, Jive communities have become more than just collaboration spaces. We see an increase in the number of companies that are actively using Jive as an additional channel of customer support. So they encourage their customers to find information, to submit questions, to share knowledge, and to get answers from other customers or from the company's own support representatives and field experts, all right there within the community. Now, obviously, this results in a lot of content that's being generated through collaboration. But in most organizations, unfortunately, the official voice of the company, your technical documentation, is basically missing from that conversation and does not provide the value it ought to be providing. Now, in addition, your customers are confused. So when a customer looks for information, where should they go? Should they go to the social community, or should they check the documentation portal? So at this point, I'd like you all to meet Mark. So Mark is a customer, right? And right now, Mark is looking to fix his cracked phone screen. He heard about the company's social community, so he went ahead, he logged in, and he then posted a question. And in this question, he asked basically if anybody knows if it's possible to even fix the correct screen, and if so, how. So Celeste, the support representative, replied to Mark and provided a link that would take Mark all the way to the relevant user guide. And guess what? She even pointed out specifically which section in that guide Mark needs to be looking at. Sounds great, right? That's perfect customer service. So it actually does sound great. However, okay, what happens when Mark is going to click that hyperlink shared by Celeste? Where would Mark be taken to? So one option is that the link is going to lead Mark to the company's documentation portal. And, you know, is there a better place than a documentation portal to host a user guide? Probably not, at least where we grew up. But let's think of it again. What are we doing here? We're basically forcing Mark to leave the community page and be redirected to the documentation portal, which looks differently and behaves differently than the community. So what kind of a usability experience are we giving to Mark? And basically, Mark is pretty much going to lose contact, and the chances of him ever getting back to the community in case he fails to find what he was looking for in the documentation portal are now much, much lower. So suddenly, it doesn't sound like such a great idea. What if we could make that content available to Mark right from within the community, right? So basically, we decided it's probably going to make more sense to make our content accessible right there in Jive. So one option we have is basically to just attach a link to the relevant PDF as part of the discussion. And while it's technically possible, totally doable, we're not sure that we really want to do it. And the main reason is that, you know, did we invest in structured topic-based content and in a state-of-the-art social collaboration platform such as Jive just so we can use PDF again? Probably not. So the other option is to get our content into Jive as HTML. So obviously, the simplest way to do it would be to simply copy-paste the relevant piece of information, taking it from the documentation, and pasting it right into the discussion. Well, technically it's going to work, but doing that might result in all sorts of issues. And some of the things you would need to reconsider are, for example, how do you keep that the pasted data stays accurate and relevant over time? So what happens if your technical writers update the documentation? And how do you avoid basically being stuck with obsolete silos of documentation within Jive and having your customers being confused because they can't tell which version is correct? The other thing you want to look at is how do you avoid data corruption following copying and pasting? So for example, what do you do with, how do you ensure that images are not missing and that links are not broken? What do you do in contextual awareness? How do you create a decent structure which ties all those various content pieces together into something that looks more like a publication? And we're going to talk a lot about that in the webinar. And last, how do we avoid making this a one-off replication, and how do we ensure that there is a clear process in place to upload documentation in a way that resonates with the natural Jive workflow? So before we answer these questions, we really first need to understand the inherent properties of Jive. And these are properties that actually, you know, it makes Jive an excellent tool for the kind of collaborative discussions which are typically held in your community, but it can also be very, very challenging when dealing with structured technical content. So first of all, documents in Jive are meant to be small and discrete. And that is quite the opposite from your typical technical document, which is obviously comprised of many pages with a clear hierarchy between those pages. So when we say that each Jive document is meant to be discrete, it also means that Jive does not offer any easy, you know, out-of-the-box way to create navigation between different related documents. It also means that Jive does not offer any out-of-the-box easy facility to create a hierarchy, something similar to what a table of content gives us within the publication. And the last thing is that Jive expects nothing less than clean and simple legal HTML. So any content that you might have that is not carefully screened and pre-formatted will just not be correctly received and represented, and you're going to have exactly these kind of data corruption issues that we were talking about before. So to overcome these challenges, we really need to make sure that we're using a solution that basically publishes your content, your structured content, right from your component content management system or right from your authoring tool into your social community. This solution needs to obviously tie down into your single source publishing process and ensure that whenever you update your content in the master of records, these updates are being pushed to Jive, which means that your community content always stays up to date. You want to make sure that the solutions support whatever structured content format you're using. Just as examples are DITA and Medcap Flare. You want to make sure that this solution converts your content and pre-processes it to ensure that it integrates naturally as part of your natural Jive workflow. And the last thing is you want to make sure that it meets enterprise requirements such as security, scalable publishing, and ease of deployment. So let's talk a little bit about, let's go behind the scene and discuss this, and let's just show where the magic lies. So if we look at how structured content works, we basically have individual topics, right, which are grouped and referenced by maps in the case of DITA or by projects in the case of Flare. And it all results in a deliverable or an output, which is an equivalent of a physical publication. So the process we take basically is we pre-process your topics and we convert each of these topics to legal HTML5. We analyze the structure of your DITA maps or your Medcap Flare projects, and based on their structure we compile a table of content and resolve all of the navigational links so that your viewers have an increased contextual awareness. And last, we basically facilitate the uploading of all that content into your Jive instance to the specific places that you dictate. So how can we expect our individual topics to look like in Jive? So what we did is basically we took the publicly available DITA-OT taskbook, which some of you are familiar with, and we uploaded the entire publication to Jive. Now in this snapshot you can see an individual topic that was uploaded to the community. So this is basically a Jive document. So among others you can see obviously the content, and the content may include text, may include images or embedded videos. It has links which include support for things like XREFs, CONREFs, parent-child links, and other type of links. And it also offers navigational breadcrumbs that provide the viewer with a sense of orientation and an ability to navigate through the publication. So, as we mentioned before, the topics always contain the most up-to-date content and are consistent with your single source publishing framework. So each topic is now a Jive document, and as such, it also has a consistent Jive URL that can now be shared with customers and employees and does not change whenever the content is being updated. So as discussed, each topic becomes its own document in Jive. Now, if we do nothing, we're going to be left with a bunch of documents with little or no structure, just like the one shown in this snapshot. And to ensure that our viewers can efficiently navigate these massive documents, we must adopt powerful structuring and navigation mechanisms. So for that, we got to provide some kind of a toolkit. And this toolkit basically includes the creation of a table of content, which again is based on the DITA map or on the Flare project structure. We want to be providing some kind of a graphical, anchor, which is used to place the table of content in the prominent section in the community. We want to make sure that we provide the navigational breadcrumbs and link as discussed. And we also want to make sure that we're tagging the documents and applying Jive metadata according to metadata collected from the source content. Now, in those snapshots, you can literally see the move we're making from a random list of documents into a coherent structure. So on top of the individual Jive documents created following the content conversion, you can see that we're basically dynamically generating an additional Jive document. And this additional Jive document basically contains the publication table of content. Now, each entry in the table of content is basically pointing out to the appropriate Jive document which contains the applicable topic. And the table of content is automatically updated on an ongoing basis to reflect any kind of changes that were made to the publication, including any topics that were added, modified, or removed. So now that we have this great table of content document, right, we got the structure. But how can we make the table of content document itself easily accessible to customers? So the secret is basically to use existing widgets and other Jive graphical elements. So this is an example of how we're able to anchor the table of content document. So essentially, the minute viewers enter your Jive group, the first thing they see is an anchored shortcut which leads them directly to the TOC, the table of content. Similar anchors can be placed in multiple tabs. Some of them are the Overview tab, the Content tab, the Activity tabs, and other places. Now, one of the things we mentioned earlier was how important it was to get your structured content streamlined with the standard Jive content workflow. Now, the typical Jive workflow for handling content includes various stages. We'll try to describe the main ones. So first of all, you need to upload your content to Jive. That's clear. And this means that your content needs to be pre-processed and converted to clean legal HTML. Next, what we want to do is we want to ensure that your content is merged, but not just merged, but merged in a smart way. So what does that mean? It actually means that whatever new content that was generated in your content management system or your authoring tool results in the creation of a new Jive document or documents. It also means that whenever your existing content was being updated, so that results in the previous version of that content being somehow tracked down in Jive and automatically replaced to reflect the latest version, all while returning your social activities. So if your users have previously, liked or shared or left comments, you probably just want to leave, to replace the content, but you don't want to lose all that social activity that may have a whole lot of knowledge in there. And the other thing is what happens with content that was removed from the content management system, for example. So whenever you have removed content, that should result in somehow, the applicable Jive documents and Jive content somehow needs to be tracked down automatically, and we need to dispose of it in a controlled way. So now that the content is stored safely in Jive, we really need to make it also accessible and findable. And as part of the process of making it accessible and findable, this also means that we need to scan for any kind of tagging, classification information, and metadata information that was defined in the source content. And we then want to convert some or all of it to standard Jive tags and metadata. And Jive has all kinds of metadata that can be used for that purpose. Now, all these activities that we mentioned, anything from the creation and updates of documents and metadata, it should all be integrated with the built-in Jive versioning workflow. Okay, now the Jive versioning workflow, for some of you that are not familiar with it, is basically the document audit trail. Or in other words, this is what ensures that we get a proper audit trail that shows us exactly which version are we looking at of the document, as well as allows us to see which updates were applied on that piece of content in the past. So we really want that whenever we're pushing in new content or whenever we're updating content, we want that to be synchronized and create a new version within Jive. So next, just before the content is published and is visible to your customer community, you may want to also route it through the standard Jive approval workflow. So this basically means that you need to decide if the content is going to be automatically visible to customers, or if first you want it to be somehow manually approved by an editor or another function that you pre-designate in your organization. And that also means if you want that content to be created in draft status or ready for publishing. Some other implications that it might have is also the type of Jive place that you're going to want to choose. Do I want to publish it to a public place, or do I want to publish it to a private place? But anyway, whenever you decided all of these, and if it needed manual approval, you got that manual approval, it will basically be published to the selected instance and to the selected place that you have chosen. The last thing, once the content is already published and is out there and your viewers are looking at it, you really want to make sure that you're assessing its impact. And to do that, you basically want to use the built-in Jive impact metrics. Some of you are familiar with these small analytics widget that basically appear for pretty much every document. And these metrics are basically showing us, on a nutshell, different analytics such as, how many people have viewed this document, what's the impact that it has made, what's the overall viewer sentiment, is it positive, is it negative, are people indifferent when they look at it, etc., etc. And all of these impact metrics can really help your writers and your community managers to assess which content is really in demand by your community members, and then they can make more educated decisions in what needs to be optimized and where do we put our our additional content resources in order to optimize content. So we've been talking about how do we get the documents and your content into the Jive workflow, but let's talk a little bit about benefits. So what are the business justification? I mean, which kind of business benefits can we expect by making our product content available in our social community? So roughly we can classify the business benefits into 3 groups. Okay, now the first group relates to the delivery of improved customer service and customer support. So we're basically talking about average support case handle time that we're able to reduce, and that's because support representatives can now quickly find, reuse, and share existing product content instead of having to reinvent the wheel. Another operational metric that we're able to improve is what's called first call resolution rate. So for those of you not familiar with the term, first call resolution is a metric that measures the rate of cases that were successfully closed following a single call, in the case of a contact center, or a single email, or a single chat for that matter. And we're also able to improve that metric mainly because the representatives are now able to share the most up-to-date and controlled version of the product content. So they no longer have to improvise or try to come up with answers based on their own memory or their own judgment or just asking other people in the organization. They see basically the one truth that comes from the master system of records. Now, the second group of benefits relate to customer satisfaction. So by making it easier for customers to find the content they're looking for right within the community, we're basically reducing the effort required from them. So when we talk about reducing effort, we're not just, these are not just buzzwords, but there is actually, very clear and very standard ways of measuring customer effort through an index that's called customer effort score. And basically, that's kind of the things where you're giving a questionnaire to a customer, right? And you ask him to rate how easy was it for you to get the transaction that you wanted to do, basically get it done, or to achieve the thing that you came here to achieve. And reducing customer effort is good also because it's known to be correlated with higher customer spending and higher customer repurchase rates. And customer who finds useful information in the community will also share that information with other customers and will contribute in the community, which basically means that we can expect increased traffic and increased traction for your social community. Now, the third and last group relates basically to the reduction of content costs. So, we all heard about single source publishing, and we know why is it important. And by synchronizing content with your single source publishing infrastructure, you're essentially eliminating potential content silos, and you're increasing reuse of your existing content assets. And obviously this has direct contribution to savings on anything relating to content generation and as well as maintenance costs. At this point, Miriam? Yeah? Okay. At this point, I would like to try and give some tips from our experience that could make the process smoother in your organization. Now, the first is about generating internal buy-in. Okay, from what we've seen with customers is basically is that getting your product content shared with your community, it basically means a lot of stakeholders. So stakeholders involved range from the marketing people, the community managers, the tech pubs, basically technical publications, technical writers, the support organization. All of them needs to be properly, make sure you brief them, make sure you get their buy-in, and make sure you all build together some kind of training plan for the community moderators, which are typically the support representatives that are using Jive as as another customer support channel, as well as the support personnel. So we're talking about training community managers, community moderators, reps, everybody. The second thing is basically start small. Okay, it's usually best to start with a very small set of publications, and the reason is that it will give the community as well as the moderators a chance to get used to the concept. So, it takes time, but over time you can gradually roll out more and more publications, and then also you can, optimize your content in a way that is more controlled, and you can use that feedback to provide more optimizations. The last thing you want to do is to optimize your community to match your customer journeys. So what does it really mean? It means that as a community manager, right, what you want to understand is what are your customers typically looking for in the community? How are they using the community? What's their typical flow if you have to chart their user journey across the community? And the answers to these questions will typically help you to decide which content you want to prioritize in terms of investment, but not just that. It's also tactically, where do you place the anchors? Where do you place the table of content? Where do you place shortcuts to relevant documents, all over the community based on these journeys in order to maximize the chance that somebody who's looking for something is actually going to find that specific place there. So at that point, we hope that you found the webinar productive and useful. And I'm going to hand it to Miriam at this point, and then we'll do our Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Hannan. I'd just like to remind everyone that we are going to have a recording of this webinar that will be going out to everyone within, I would say, 24 hours. Now is the time to ask your questions. I see we have one. Do you want to take it, Hannan?
Yeah, sure. Let me just see that. Okay. How do you apply metadata to Jive documents? That's the question. So the answer is twofold. First of all, we're importing tags, right, for data or from Flare, and we're applying that as standard Jive tags. The other thing we're able to do is basically we're able to absorb metadata and inject that into something that Jive calls extprops, or external properties. So external properties are basically the equivalent of metadata in the sense that it's hidden metadata fields that you can update, but that are not visible. Unlike tags, they're not visible to viewers. But we still can basically populate them and then query based on them, which means that potentially whatever metadata you've had in your source content can be, flawlessly exported to Jive and be retained there. Let's see if we have other questions. The other question we have is basically, do you have to have a connection to the CMS for data? Is this the other props? I assume you're referring to X props. Well, basically what we're doing, you don't have to have a connection to the CMS. I mean, obviously we need to have access to the source content. So if the source content, can reside on your local client machine for that matter, and we're just going to take it from there by analyzing the structure. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, Miriam, I think that's it.
Okay, terrific. Thank you very much for attending. And if somehow we missed your question, please feel free to email it to me. You all have my email address, and I will try to make sure it's answered. thanks again, and thank you, Hannan, for an excellent presentation, and be in touch.
All right. Thank you, everybody.